that our Vue applications make API calls. It's pretty common that our Vue applications make API calls. And when they do, it's a best practice to let our users know that something is loading, especially if it might take a little while to return from the API call. Then once it returns, we display the template onto the page. The simplest way to implement this is with a simple if and else. As our application grows, it's not uncommon to have one component that makes an API call and then another component somewhere else that makes an API call. And we might want to have a loading component up here at this parent component and not display the component until both API calls have been returned. Here at Vue Mastery, we've shown how to solve this problem using Vuex because we can have a global state with loading status. However, in Vue 3, there's a new feature which provides an even better solution. This is the suspense component. To use it, we simply put it inside of a template. We don't have to import it, our component already has access. Then we specify a default template. This is where we put components, one or more of which has a setup method that returns a promise or an asynchronous component. Then we specify a fallback template. This is what to display when we're loading. Let's build out a simple example. Here we'll put our event component. We've used this in previous lessons. Then we'll simply display loading while this is loading. Inside of our script tag, we'll simply include this event component. And let's take a look inside that file right now. What's inside here? It might look something like this. And we're using the event space composable, which we used in a previous lesson. Don't worry, you don't have to know this event composable to understand what's going on. I want you to notice that this component has asynchronous, or just async before it's set up, and functions that use async also need to use await. Our useEventSpace composable is making that API call. And we don't need a composable to call suspense. This could easily be a service library that does API calls for us, or we could just be doing the API call right here. So if we load this up in the browser, we can see that our fallback template showing loading gets loaded first, and then when the promise resolves, it displays the default template. Suspense waits for all the asynchronous calls to be resolved before displaying the default template. We can test this out simply by using the event component twice. So if we load up our browser, we see loading, and then only once both API calls have returned does it display the default template. The killer feature of suspense is that we can have deeply nested API calls, and it's going to wait until they're all resolved. That's pretty cool, but when we're dealing with API calls, we also have to make sure to implement error handling. And how do we do that with suspense? Here's our previous code, and let's add some error handling. First, we'll import ref, and we'll need to use the onErrorCaptured lifecycle hook. Then inside our setup method, we'll declare a reactive reference called error. Then we'll use the onErrorCaptured lifecycle hook to listen for errors, and if they happen, it'll set the error and then return true. Return true simply prevents the error from propagating and then appearing in our user's browser. Then in the template, we'll check to see if we have an error. If so, let's display it. And then we put the velse as an attribute on the suspense component. If we look in our browser and we get a network error, it gets displayed as we would expect. I'm definitely looking forward to using suspense in my Vue 3 applications. And one user interface best practice we can use with it are skeleton loading screens. So rather than having a spinner, we can do what you see here on the right. These skeleton loading screens are getting more and more common all around the internet. And in the lesson resources, I'll link to a few articles that show you how to put them together. Thanks for watching. Use component architecture allows us to build our user interface into components, which beautifully organize our business logic and our presentation layer. However, there are some instances where one component has some HTML that needs to get rendered in an alternative location. Why might you want to do this? Well, some components like modals with fixed or absolute positioning and z-index may need to be placed right before the body tag, and there's no best practice on how to do this. Also, if our Vue application is running on a small part of our web page, we might want to move some of that template code out of our Vue app. And again, there's no easy way to do this. Luckily, Vue 3 now has a teleport component. This was previously called Portal, but the name was changed to Teleport as to not conflict to a future version of HTML where they might have a tag called Portal. Teleport allows us to specify template HTML we can send to another part of the DOM. Let's jump into a real simple example. First, inside of our public index.html, right under where our application is rendered, I've added an end of body div. We want to teleport some template code here. Then, inside of our app.view, inside our template, we'll write teleport to end of body. We'll specify the text we want to teleport. This should be the end. And then we'll write this should be the top. If this works right, this should be the end, should be teleported out of our Vue application and into this div, actually putting it at the end of our page. And if we look in our browser, we see that indeed it is teleported to the end. In order to use the teleport component, you need to define a to attribute which takes a valid DOM query selector. In our case, we're using the ID, but we could also be using a class like so, or a data selector with square brackets. In this case, our div would look like this, in case you're not familiar with the data attribute. Or this could even be a dynamic property by adding the colon. Modals and pop-ups often stay hidden until they're displayed on the screen. This is why teleport has a disabled attribute. And when it's true, the content's going to stay inside the component, and when it's false, it'll be teleported to the destination you specify. Let's update our code and try this. We'll start by specifying a showText reactive property, which defaults to false. Then back in our previous code, this will be disabled when showText is false. Then we'll create a button to toggle showText between true and false. Now our code is either inside our component or is teleported outside the component when it's not disabled. And if we look inside DevTools, we can see our code inside our template. And then once we toggle it, we can see it teleported into the end of body div. And if we toggle it back, we see it back inside of our component. One killer feature of teleport is that it reuses the DOM elements, so state is preserved. We can see this if we place a video inside of our teleport component. So now we can see, as we toggle this video, the state is preserved. Let's watch that one more time. If the content we had inside teleport was a modal, we wouldn't want to display it until it was teleported and not disabled. So how would we hide the text when teleport is disabled? One way we can do this is simply by using a vif with showText. So now it's only going to show this should be the end when showText is true. In this case, only when it's teleported. When I first saw this feature, I started to wonder, what happens if we teleport two different things to the same location? Does it still work? Let's give it a try. I'm going to make some room in my code. I'll add a new reactive property called showText2. I'll create a new teleport component, which uses showText2 and says this should be at the end too. And then I'll create another button to toggle it. Let's take a look at what this does. It's properly appending and removing the DOM nodes from the end of our page. As you can see, the teleport component in Vue 3 provides you a powerful way to write component template code which gets teleported to other parts of your application. Congratulations, you got to the end of the Vue 3 Essentials course. I am now going to go work. Congratulations, you got to the end of the Vue 3 Essentials course. I am now going to go work on the Vue 3 Reactivity course, which by the time you're watching this may or may not be available. So either go and do it or keep an eye out for it. One or the other. And again, thanks for getting through the course.